Thank you for joining us today. My name is Mike Whitmer. Today's webinar is a culmination of a series of 4 webinars focusing on buying, selling, and valuing chiropractic practices. If you missed any of the first 3 webinars, you can find them for free at ncmic.com under the resources section. Today's webinar is the culmination. It's a live Q&A with our subject matter expert, Crystal Misenheimer. Before we get started, there are, of course, a few housekeeping items I'd like to review with you. Our goal today is to address your questions. We've received some questions in advance, which will get us started, but to keep the conversation going, please enter any questions you have in the chat feature of the webinar platform. We'll address your questions as time allows. This webinar is being recorded. The recording will be emailed to registered attendees following the program. We will also post the recording in the resources section of ncmic.com following the broadcast. It does take a bit of time to get the recording ready to go, so you can expect to access that by the end of day tomorrow. But now let's meet Crystal. Crystal Misenheimer is lead broker from Progressive Practice Sales. Crystal has been our guest before, and we've had such a great response. We wanted to have her back to do this series of webinars on the topics of building your practice value, thoughtful succession planning, purchasing a practice. There are so many issues that we can talk with Crystal about. This is a very popular topic, and I'm looking forward to learning so much. So I'm really excited to have Crystal back. Crystal, welcome. Great to talk to you again.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me. I'm looking forward to the conversation today.
Well, thanks for being here. So let's dig in. The first question that we got, it said, I noticed a practice in Houston selling for $109,000, and the net income for the previous year was $106,000. Is that a normal average selling price for a practice around the net income of the previous year, or an average of the last 3 to 4 years net income? If that clinic for sale is an aberration, is most of the value of a practice determined by the financial profitability of the practice, and what besides net income is used? So a lot to pack in on that one. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think it's important to understand that when you're going to sell a practice, part of what you're looking at is what is the practice value? And then you're also looking at what are your sale goals. And so when you see a practice that's priced really close to the net profit, you probably have one of a couple of scenarios going on. So one is probably that the doctor who's selling the practice would like to sell sooner rather than later. So they're pricing the practice pretty aggressively to try and get extra attention in the sale and try and move usually into retirement or relocation a little bit faster. So I can't speak to the value of that particular practice, but in most situations, the practice value is going to be a multiple of the profit and not exactly right where the profit was before. There are some scenarios where that could be the actual value, though. A clinic that is in a state of decline might be in a situation where there's not really a multiple of the profit just because there's more risk involved. The value of the practice is definitely based on the profitability. That's the foundation of it. But there's a lot of factors that we look into when we're assigning a multiple to that profit. In order to determine the value. And one of them is definitely the risk. Another one is the demand for practices like that. So depending on the area and the practice model, the trends in the practice, which I already touched on a little bit, if the practice is growing, it's generally going to have a higher multiple than if it's showing a declining pattern. There's also the type of buyer that's going to be a good fit for that practice. How large the practice is, the larger the profit, typically the higher the multiple. So there's a lot of factors that go into it. But when you see a price on a practice, just understand that part of it's the valuation and part of it's the strategy of what the seller is trying to achieve.
All right. A lot of the common concepts here are, not unlike, selling a house. It depends on location, what condition the house is in, that sort of thing, which leads me to the next question, which is, what is the typical fee charged by a practice broker? Is it close to the 6 or 7%, similar to what we experience with a real estate agent or broker?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that when you're making the comparison between a business sale and a real estate sale, it's important to understand that a business sale has a lot more complexity to it. So, whereas a typical real estate sale, the real estate agent might have that listing for 3 or 4 months. They might put, 20 to 30 hours into that transaction. A business sale, usually the broker has the listing for about a year, and they're going to if if they're a very involved broker who's putting in the work that I think is necessary for these sales, they're going to be putting a couple hundred hours into the transaction. So it's kind of like a real estate sale exponentially, on steroids. So,
Yeah.
so the fee for a business sale is higher than real estate, and it varies. I've seen brokerage fees for business sales run anywhere up to 12% versus the 6% that I think is common for real estate. There's certainly no formal percentage in either area. At our firm, our percentages range from 8.5 to 9.5%.
Yeah. And there's, a lot more to it, as far as selling a practice than a house, but, kind of um, on the same topic of, real estate, in a lot of practices, real estate is a factor.
Yes.
So how does the practice real estate factor into the sale of the practice?
It's such a good question. And if you own your real estate, it's something that you really do have to think about strategically before you make any steps in your practice sale or retirement strategy, because the value of the real estate is definitely going to impact the value of the practice. And there's a lot of things you have to think about as you're planning that. So a lot of doctors fall into the situation where they bought their practice real estate several decades ago. It has appreciated dramatically in value. So if you get to the point where you're ready to retire and you have real estate that has gone up and up and up in value, but maybe you've started to step out of your practice, slow down a little bit, go to part-time hours, what you have is you have a situation where the real estate, either the rent is going to be really high for a practice that's not generating enough revenue to support that. Or if you really want to sell both of them at the same time, it's possible that the profit from the practice won't support a loan for both the real estate and the practice. So understanding the value of the property early on is important so that you can decide, does it make sense to try and build the practice up so that it better supports the value of the real estate? Does it maybe make sense to have a two-part transaction where you sell the commercial real estate first, relocate the practice, and then sell the practice a few years later? Does it make sense to look at a strategy where you're trying to sell both? And if you do, how do you combine those, and what kind of buyer is going to be a good fit? So, a practice sale is complicated because it has a lot of moving parts. And anytime you add anything else into that, it just increases the complexity of it. So if there's also going to be a real estate component, if you're also going to try and have a long-term buyout with an associate doctor, any of these other, sort of ancillary transactions that you want to wrap in together, it just increases the need to have a strategy and a plan going into it.
Yeah. So, let's add to that complexity a little bit here and bring in the concept of prepaid services. So,
Yeah.
a lot of docs I know, do prepaid plans. So if I've got a lot of those on the books, what impact does that have on my sale?
Yeah, that's such an important question, and it's one that a lot of chiropractors really need to think about, because essentially prepaid services are a liability of the business. It's money that's been paid to you for an obligation that has to be provided in the future. And so when you go to sell the practice, that's not just money that you've earned, it's actually money that is in theoretically at least in an escrow account waiting to be distributed back to your practice as those services are provided. So when a buyer comes in, that may be their expectation that those funds are going to be refunded to them at closing. Sometimes there's some other options that can be employed that will make a lot of sense. Sometimes you can trade accounts receivable for the prepaid services. Sometimes you can do an extended transition where the selling doctor works in the practice after the sale closes and essentially works off that prepaid balance. It really just depends on how high the prepaid balance is and what the services that are going to be rendered look like. I think that any doctor who has prepaid services as part of their practice, they really need to find out, how their state looks at prepaid services and what the opportunities that are there on how the contract with the patient can be structured. Can it have an expiration date? That type of thing, because ultimately you do want to create a situation where that liability doesn't just grow and grow and become something that is really cumbersome to handle when it comes time to close.
Sure. Okay. Um, so another question. Will I get a better price if I offer owner financing? So I read that as, okay, I'm selling it. If I'm willing to provide the financing for the buyer, is that going to sweeten the pot a little bit? Is that going to make the price better, or will it not impact it? Or, I doubt it would negatively impact it, but let's hear from you.
Yeah. Yeah, a lot of doctors ask that actually. And the truth is that chiropractic practices, there's more of an established marketplace for chiropractic practices than there is for a lot of other types of healthcare practices. And so what that means is you have a marketplace where buyers can go and they can see a lot of different practices and they can really understand, what can I get for the investment that I'm making? And so from that perspective, it's hard to inflate the price very much based on offering owner financing, because a buyer who's qualified and can get financing from a bank, they'll look at it as essentially, I can go through the hardship of getting a loan, which can definitely be challenging, and it can take time and it has some closing costs associated with it. Or I can do owner financing. How much of a benefit do I get from doing the owner financing? And in most cases, it's not as significant enough to have a really, a significantly higher cost associated with the owner finance practice. So what I've seen is that really the only buyer who would be really open to paying significantly more for a practice that is being owner financed is the one that can't get lending from the bank. And in most cases, that's going to be a buyer who's going to present a lot more risk to the doctor, who really doesn't have a lot of great options if the buyer doesn't make those payments on the seller finance note. So in most cases, the reward that the seller can get from owner financing doesn't really offset the risk that they take on by selling through that model. So we always advise our clients, if at all possible, to avoid owner financing, that there are definitely options for qualified buyers to be able to get lending. And in most cases, that's just going to be the best option for everybody involved.
Yeah. So just let's dig down on that one
Yeah.
just a little bit.
Yeah.
So, what if a practice is sold, the seller finances the sale, and the buyer doesn't perform? What options are available?
So it's all going to be dictated by the laws in your state
Sure.
and how that can be, how you can mitigate the risk in the contract for selling the practice and the promissory note, which is that the seller finance portion of the contract. So you might have some different options there, and then depending on the buyer and how they bought the practice and what kind of structure they have as far as their finances, there may be some options for going after different assets. You may be able to put liens on certain things if they will allow that during the practice sale when you're negotiating that contract. But overall, it's going to be very challenging for anyone who owner finances to go after someone who doesn't pay them, unless they have a lot of other businesses and other assets and things like that under the same structure, the same entity or their own personal ownership as how they own your practice. They just have so many ways that they can protect those assets. And for somebody who just decides, I don't want to do this anymore, the path to bankruptcy can often be very easy. And so, if they declare bankruptcy, then there's not really anything you can do besides get in line with the other creditors. So I'm not an expert in this by any stretch of the imagination, but what I tell my clients who are considering owner financing is, you need to get a significant down payment at closing. You need to make sure that that new owner has skin in the game. And you need to make sure that whatever you got at closing, ultimately, you would be okay if that was all you got, because that's really all you're guaranteed to get when you go into a
Sure.
payment structure. So for a lot of doctors who are looking at, selling one of their biggest assets and something that they've spent decades of their life building, that doesn't fit what's going to work for them. And so in that case, owner financing is just not a fit for those
Yeah.
deals.
Yeah. Okay. Let's shift gears a little bit. Question that we got, are practices valued off of blue sky? And I think if you could start there and explain what blue sky means.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's a lot of different terms that get floated around when you talk about practice valuation, and blue sky is definitely one of them. So what blue sky is it's potential. Theoretically, you can grow any business infinitely, right? The truth is that that's not that easy and not that achievable, especially in a practice like a chiropractic practice where you have a physical space and you have people, performing something on patients. There's only so much time in the day and space in the practice, but a lot of people will talk about blue sky and talk about the opportunities that a practice has, and I think that opportunity and growth potential is fantastic when you're thinking about buying a practice. It is definitely something you should consider because it's how you get a really strong return on your investment. There's a doctor who went to part-time hours and it's in a great area, and the ratio of chiropractors to residents in that area is favorable, and the practice used to see a lot more people and just now they're at lower hours. You have some good growth potential there. You've got great blue sky, but the practice won't value on that blue sky because that is any value that comes from that is going to come off of the new owner's hard work. So it's something to take into consideration, but it's not anything that you would actually value the practice on.
Okay. Yeah, I hear that term all quite a bit, and it's like, what exactly is that? So thank you for that. So,
Yeah.
uh, do I need to use a broker if I already have a buyer and an attorney? So I'm reading this as, I've already got a buyer, ready to go. I've got an attorney that's going to, do all the legal work with it. Do I need to use a broker?
Yeah, that's a question that we get a lot. And the truth is that you really need a team to sell a practice. Even a small practice, there's just a lot of moving parts. There's a lot of specific knowledge that makes these transactions work. So they're really just very intricate business transactions. And the attorney has a definite role. You can't sell a practice without an attorney. We always have attorneys work with our clients. It's a requirement to work with us. But the attorney's job, they're there to make sure that you're protected in the contracts, that the contracts cover your unique situation, that they fit in with the contractual requirements in your state for business contracts. Their role is pretty defined. As far as actually managing your transaction, they're usually not a good fit for that. And that's because their specialty is in law and it's not in transaction management. A lot of times they can't even talk to the other party. They can only talk to the other party's attorney, which is the most expensive way to get one of these transactions done. Oftentimes they don't really have the best manner in order to help support people who are confused and overwhelmed trying to go through this process. They don't necessarily give that hand holding and that supportive education that really keeps the process moving. And it's just not what they're there to do. And so they're not really trained in it. They don't have the experience in it. So that's where the broker comes in, is as the transaction manager. So, we've done hundreds of these transactions and we've consulted on thousands of them. So we have so much experience in the moving parts in these sales. And that's where you get the benefit of working with us, because we know exactly what needs to happen next. We can see the red flags of things not going the way that they're supposed to from a mile away, and we can point them out and find workarounds to get around them. We know how to work with the lenders. We know how to work with the attorneys. We know how to work with the CPAs. We know how to get things done. I've talked to other brokers who have said, basically our job is to be a pusher. We're pushing people to do all the things that they need to do. And, that involves hundreds of check-ins and reach outs and follow-ups and making sure people know what they need to do and that they have the answer on how to do it. When you think about an attorney taking that on, and you think about the way an attorney bills in 15-minute increments, it's just not a good fit for that portion of your sale. So whether you have a buyer or you don't have a buyer, a broker is going to bring invaluable support to your sale for those reasons.
Yeah, and I think that the thought behind, okay, I've got the buyer, why do I need a broker? Because the broker finds the buyer, right? Well, there's so much more to it, but I think that when you look at it from a dollars and cents perspective, okay, you said that your fee is, what was it, 8, 9, 10% in there,
Yes,
okay, that's a cost. But
sure.
what are you paying the attorney and the buyer's attorney? And, for them to do this transactional hand holding, you may be money ahead doing the broker route.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if you work with a really good broker, they're absolutely going to keep your legal costs down and your accounting costs down. And they're also going to really optimize your chances for success so that you don't have to go back to the drawing board and start all over again.
Okay. Question. I love this question. And I wonder if it's how limited we're going to be able to do it. But what is the biggest mistake chiropractors make when selling a practice? And I would imagine that there's a variety of mistakes that are made that, going through these transactions. With all the transactions you've worked with, what's the biggest one?
Well, that is a big question for sure. I think that, the biggest mistakes that I've seen are where something got missed. And, they didn't realize that it was important. It just didn't cross their minds as something that needed to be disclosed, or they just forgot it ever happened. And then it comes up and it just blows up the sale. But I think that ties into the most common problem that we see. And the most common problem we see in these transactions is just relying on faulty information. And sometimes that information comes from, someone else who has done something similar, and they had something that worked in their situation, and nobody knows, and nobody in that conversation knows enough to know that doesn't apply for everybody. This was something that worked in this situation, but doesn't apply to the next person down the road who wants to, sell a practice. Or sometimes that information comes from someone who's a trusted advisor in something else. And they're really an expert in something else, but they only have just, very baseline knowledge in practice sales. And so because they're such an expert in something else, you rely on them. But it ends up that really wasn't good advice in order to sell your practice. And, we've seen stuff like this time and again, where it becomes part of the selling doctor's, just baseline understanding of how the process works. Well, of course I'm going to do it this way. And then when we finally get down to, well, why aren't you doing what needs to be done? It's because they have this foundational understanding of a practice sale that just isn't true. Like, for example, we have someone in our for sale by owner program last year, and they would not provide us with the financial data that we needed in order to package the practice. And, you can't sell a practice without that financial data. And when we finally got them to kind of open up as to why they didn't want to do this, it was because a family member, I think it was maybe a brother-in-law, had owned a business and felt like that was not information that should be released to anybody until you had a contract. And you're never going to get to a contract if you don't have that financial information. You just can't. Now, that doesn't mean that you just give the prospective buyer who just walks in off the street, your tax returns and, bank statements, but you do need to have the proper financial preparation in order to have any success. And unfortunately, by the time we got to the bottom of that conversation, doctor had run out of time. They were just basically ready to close the practice. And, had they been willing to have that conversation, that transparent conversation 6 months earlier, it would have been a very different situation. But because that was just their baseline understanding of this process, it just never, of course I wouldn't do that. And, they lost an opportunity.
Okay. So those questions were kind of, broker seller oriented. I've got a few that are specific to the buying doctor. First one, why do I pay for goodwill? And how do I know I'll even get any benefit from that? And I believe that's from the buyer's perspective, so that when they're buying, there's this value of goodwill. First of all, could you explain what goodwill is and how does the buyer benefit from that, or do they?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is another one of those terms that's just kind of a weird word
Right.
that
Kind of like
people
blue
throw around.
sky.
Exactly.
Yeah.
A lot of people get try and use the two
Yep.
interchangeably, and they're not interchangeable. So goodwill is the intangible benefit that you get when you buy a business. And so it is the benefit that transfers at the time of closing. So not the potential, but what is actually transferring. So what is intangible benefit? It's things like the name recognition in the community. It's the phone number and the fact that there are people in this community that have that phone number saved in their cell phone. They have the magnet on their fridge with the phone number. If they get hurt, that's the phone number that they know to call to schedule an appointment for a chiropractor. It's the signage that people have been driving by for the past 20 years, knowing that that's a chiropractic office. So if they get in a car accident, like, oh, I drive by that place every day, I'm going to go there. And, so you think about that goodwill and that intangible benefit and that reputation in the community, and you think about what it took to build that. So goodwill is the kind of thing that it literally takes the blood, sweat, and tears that the business owner has been pouring into that business for years to decades. Sometimes multiple generations of chiropractors have been putting that work into that community. And it's just built up this awareness that this is a resource in that community. You think, well, how do I know that that's going to transfer to me? Well, that's how the business continues to operate, right? That's what drives those numbers every year, because the business, it has patients and they come in and they see the doctor and they come and go. The reason why they come and go is because they know that that practice is there. And the new patients that come in from the marketing that has been going in that community, it's because of that recognition to it. So, when you think about that intangible benefit, you can either, pay for it by buying a practice, or you can put in those years of hard work and toil and trial and error to see what really connects with people in that community in order to create the same thing. And that is by far the biggest value that you get in buying a chiropractic practice, is the years of time of trial and error and, losing money and trying things that didn't work, that you get to bypass, and you just get to step into this practice where it's already been figured out.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. So, along the, is goodwill, is that synonymous with brand?
So partially. I mean,
Mhm.
certainly if the practice is really well branded and the branding is on, the signs and it's on the marketing all over the community, and they've got, something kind of catchy that people know, then absolutely, that is part of it. But I think that it's more than that, because I think it's also just, when you think about chiropractic practices, what I always think of is the, chiropractor, at the
Hmm.
grocery store. And, the fact that when you drive by, that that's a chiropractic office. And so if you ever needed one, you kind of have seen the ones that are convenient to your location. So it's more than just the name, unless the name is, you know, really prominent. And there certainly
Yeah,
are clinics. They're usually going to be a clinic group that has like a really prominent brand, because
yeah,
the fact that there's more than one is what really builds the value.
got it. Thank you for clarifying that.
Yeah.
Okay. So here's one, young doc. Will banks really give me a loan with my student loan debt? And I know, I do a lot of work with students. I was on a chiropractic campus yesterday, and there is a lot of angst about student debt, and rightfully so. It's a big number for a lot of students. Can a new doc that has this large student loan number on their balance sheet, can they expect to walk into a bank and expect to get financing to purchase a practice?
Yeah. Yes. So the answer is maybe, right?
Yeah,
So the
as
student
most
loan
answers are with banking, it's maybe.
debt. Yes. So the student loan debt is going to be an issue at a lot of banks. Every bank sort of has their own metrics and their own rules around who they will lend to and what they'll lend on. And for a lot of banks, it just won't work with that student loan debt on the balance sheet. And so it is really important when you go to do this that you have the right resources, because you can't just walk into, the Bank of America that's down the street from you and get a business loan. That will probably never work for 99% of the people that try it. And most lending is also set up for people who are already successful. So that means they have assets like a real estate or investment accounts that can be tied to these loans and secure them. So most of the lending products out there are not a good fit for these students with this loan. So, most banks not a fit, most lending products not a fit. But there are definitely banks that will lend to chiropractors who have that student loan debt. And the reason why they will do that is because they understand that that debt is not necessarily bad debt. It was used to reach a certain professional level that allows them to go in and provide these services and make this money in these income producing businesses. So when you're buying a business, it's just different than buying a house. The house and the property, it adds to your net worth, but it has a cost associated with it that's draining your bank account every month. So, the student loan debt really impacts your ability of what you can buy for real estate. But when you buy a business, that business is putting more money into your bank account than what the loan payment is coming out. I mean, it needs to, otherwise the bank won't give you a loan for it. So if you buy the right practice, and it fits your financial needs, including paying your student loan payment, then the right banks will lend to you, provided that outside of that student loan, you've been financially responsible. So you can't have also, maxed out credit card debt. You can't have, been irresponsible in making payments on things. So if you take good care of your credit, then that student loan debt is not going to be the reason why the right bank would say no to you.
Okay, so I want to drill down a little bit into the
Yeah.
credit score.
Yeah.
In your experience, is there a range that if you're below this number, you're you may as well look at an association? Is there a number that if you're below that, you're going to be really challenged to find financing to purchase a practice?
Yes. So the number is 680.
Okay,
So if you have a credit score over 680, then you, on that metric, qualify for a small business administration loan. And that's
gotcha.
the SBA program. And that's what most chiropractors will need to buy their first practice. And we have a lot of chiropractors that have gone back and bought multiple practices, and they still go through the SBA because the SBA has good terms, and it's just a better fit than a lot of the conventional lending products out there that eventually you'll qualify for. But with your first practice, you definitely won't.
Okay. All right. Hey, for those listening, we are getting toward the end of our questions. So if you have any questions for Crystal that you would like for me to pose, now's the time. All right. So go ahead and enter those into the chat feature on the webinar platform. So, what are some red flags to watch for when buying a practice? So when we're looking at a practice, what are some things that should give you pause?
Sure. I think if I was helping somebody buy a practice, the first thing that would raise red flags for me would be lack of transparency. And again, the seller should not be put in a place where, they're at risk for, identity theft or anything like that. But there's certain information that is just very standard to a business sale. And if that's not being made available to the buyer, then that would be a big problem. That I would find that to be very alarming. And one of the reasons for that is because businesses are complicated. You can talk to 100 chiropractors and you would probably have 100 very different practices if you really started to dig into it. So in order to understand these businesses, you need to get a fair amount of data on the business, and then you need to go in and start comparing the data in different areas and making sure everything matches up, because that's how you understand that you've got a full picture of the practice. So if you can't get the data to do that kind of analysis, then there's a really strong likelihood that you will not really understand the practice that you're buying. And I have definitely seen people do that, much to their detriment later, because sometimes there can be some things in there that weren't necessarily hidden intentionally. It's just something that no one ever thought about mentioning. It didn't seem like it was material or important, and then it ended up being a big deal to where maybe the buyer wasn't able to achieve the same financial return from the business. Maybe the expenses weren't fully documented on the financial statement. Maybe the way that the doctor was billing for services isn't something that the new owner could continue. Maybe some of the revenue that was coming in to the practice didn't really transfer to the new owner. And it's just nothing that anyone thinks about, because for them it's all very straightforward, but for the new owner, there's a lot of information that you need to understand. And along those same lines, I think it's also really important to understand anything that has changed in the practice over the last couple of years, or anything that will be different in the practice after you take it over, because those things can have significant impacts to the profitability of the practice. One of the things that comes to mind immediately is a doctor who's going to stay in the practice after the sale closes and work part-time. If that's not determined before the sale is all figured out, then you can have a dramatically different number that the new owner will be taking home that can really impact their ability to pay their loan. So you just have to understand, you have to get enough data, and you have to understand what that all means. And so any barriers to that would be, I think, probably the biggest concern.
Sure. Okay, I've got one more question. So, docs, if you have any questions, now's the time. Crystal, this is the fourth webinar in this series, and we've done webinars before in previous years as well. I really appreciate your help with these. I think that this is terrific information. But the last question I have is if you could tell us a little bit about your company Progressive Practice Sales.
Yeah, so my husband and I co-founded this company 10 years ago, and we did that after we sold our third chiropractic practice. And every time that we went through that process, we used a different broker, and every time it was just a really messy transaction. We always had things that we had to clean up afterwards. We always felt really lost along the way, like we didn't have the support that we needed. So after the third time, we thought, chiropractors are just unique, and chiropractic clinics are unique businesses. And I think that they just need a different level of support than what is out there and available. So we decided to build the brokerage that we wish we would have had access to when we were trying to navigate these transactions. So we've been doing this for 10 years now. In that time, I got my designation as a certified business intermediary, which puts me essentially in the top 3% of brokers, of business brokers in the country in terms of the volume of transactions that I've done and my knowledge and experience. So, it just allows us to offer this really unique way to support chiropractors, having been both on the transactional side of it ourselves, and then also having this really in-depth professional education and experience to be able to help people to navigate kind of whatever gets thrown at them during these processes, because they're unique. Each one's a little bit different. Each one has its own complexities, and you know it's the kind of thing that you really don't want to do on your own, and you really want to have someone who's walked that walk so many times before that they could basically lead you through it blindfolded. So that's what we've built.
Okay, thank you. It's great to get to know people with companies that are specific to chiropractic, because chiropractic is so unique and so
Yes.
wonderful. It's great to have people that are committing their careers to helping chiropractors through their journeys. So thank you very much. I appreciate it. So I think that we'll go ahead and stop there, Crystal. Thank you so much. Great information. And that does wrap up our series on buying and selling practices, succession planning, and all the topics that we've covered throughout the series. Thanks to all the doctors who have tuned in and listened. I hope that this has become a great resource for you. While on the topic of resources, I'd like to remind you of the resources section of ncmic.com. This webinar will be posted there along with a library of past webinars on a variety of topics and lots of articles and information to help your practice. The previous 3 webinars in this series are out there as well, so if you missed those initially, you can go back and catch up. You can also keep up to date on new resources from NCMIC by following us on Facebook, LinkedIn, and Instagram. Finally, a huge thank you to Crystal Misenheimer with Progressive Practice Sales for the great information and the collaboration with us. Crystal, I appreciate your generosity in sharing your knowledge, and thanks again. I hope that we have the opportunity to bring more of your terrific insights and information to the chiropractic profession. So thanks. Great to see you. Look forward to seeing you out on the road again sometime soon.
Absolutely. Thank you again.
All right. Take care. Thank you.
You too.